Okay, thank you very much. And of course, it's always a pleasure for me to come back and talk with the Atlanta Science Tavern and Science for Georgia. And I'm just so happy that Georgia has such a thriving scientific community that I can give these talks to them. And it's sad that we're not in manuals altogether, but I did bring my own beverage and I am drinking locally as well, which you all should do. Okay, so let's go to just an outline of what we're going to talk about tonight, and just three main points is that it's about traces. Those of you who have seen me give talks before, I study traces, tracks, trails, burrows, nests, etc. And I look at modern ones and fossil ones. And even if you haven't seen me talk about them before, I'll just tell you that traces tell us a lot about what's out there. It expands our awareness, and especially on the Georgia coast, where you have these intertwined histories of natural history and human history, you can really put those together by using traces as a tool. These histories also can be used to predict the future, and that's something I like to think about as a paleontologist and geologist is what can we learn from the past that applies to now and that we can use to guide us as we go into the future. Also, I love to point out how as a geologist, I also could easily play a biologist on TV because there is such an intersection between geology and biology when you use traces as your medium. And my new book, Tracking the Golden Isles, has 4 parts, and that's the way I've organized the talk tonight, is to have these 4 parts where we think about part 1, as geologists, what does the Georgia coast teach us about the geologic past, and how can we understand that geologic history of the Georgia coast? Part 2 is about invertebrates, shells and carapaces, and how these invertebrates leave traces in what they're doing. Part 3 is beaks and bones, about vertebrates, vertebrate animals, and the traces they leave. And then part 4, we get into those anthropocentric beings we call humans. And what sort of traces have humans left on the Georgia coast over the last 5,000 years or so? What does that mean then in terms of going into the future? So part 1, impressions of the past. On the left there is a fossil horseshoe crab, and on the right is a modern horseshoe crab about the same size from the Georgia coast, both of them leaving tracks, but the one on the left from the Jurassic period, you can see is literally dead in its tracks. So oftentimes with paleontology and geology, if I tell people I'm a paleontologist and I study trace fossils, this is what they think of as ichnology field research. And this is in northwestern Montana, where I'm at the world famous Egg Mountain site, looking at some of the late Cretaceous rocks there, some of the insect traces, crayfish burrows, dinosaur tracks, dinosaur feces, and other trace fossils that are in that fantastic landscape there. Or you might go down to southeastern Australia, to the coast of Victoria, with the Cretaceous rocks there and those wonderful strata that tell about a polar environment going back more than 100 million years ago. And what were the dinosaurs, insects, crayfish, and other animals doing in those riverine environments way back then? But is this ichnology research? Getting on your bike, riding on the beach, having a good time on Jekyll Island? Well, yeah, sure, it can be, especially if you're looking for traces, which Ruth and I normally every Thanksgiving, we're not doing it this Thanksgiving, but normally every Thanksgiving we go to the Georgia coast, to Jekyll Island, we take our bikes with us and we go out on the beach. One year when we were down there during Thanksgiving, as we're riding on the beach, we see these little clusters of clams. And we go, I wonder what those are about. So we stop, we start taking a look, and next thing you know, we're being ichnologists. Those clusters of clams, those teeny weeny little clams, those dwarf surf clams, were clustering around, and you can see up in the upper left, there is a little flap of sand there. That was hiding a whelk. These are really big marine snails, gastropods. All of these animals had buried themselves at low tide. Why? Why did they do that? They were all buried and they were all clustered together. Did they like each other, or was there some other reason? Well, we investigated a little bit further. We rode our bikes down the beach a little bit further and we saw some of these whelks actually in action, where they were actually burrowing into the soft sand as the tide had dropped. And we realized, the whelks are actually burying themselves so that they can survive this tidal cycle. For the next 6 hours, they would be protected from drying out, from seagulls, or curious humans. What was very interesting about this was that then we found examples of where the little dwarf surf clams, almost like an entourage, were following the whelks. And they were following them and burying themselves in the wake of the whelks as the whelks were burying themselves. So why were these dwarf surf clams concentrated around the whelks? Finally, I figured it out. Here's what was happening. The whelk, as it's burrowing, just like if you went down to the beach and you suddenly did a flash dance, where you're a maniac and your feet are going up and down on the sand, you liquefy the sand. What happens is the grains of sand move apart from one another, water goes in, and it becomes a localized quicksand. So this means the burrowing of the whelk actually made burrowing for the dwarf surf clams easier. Why were the dwarf surf clams burrowing? So that they could avoid also getting eaten or drying out. So this was local quicksand being made by the whelks, and the dwarf surf clams were taking advantage of that. So here's the one step. First, you need a burrowing whelk. Then the dwarf surf clams are burying themselves in that soft sand. Oh, this third part. Now that's unexpected. It seems like a large number of the dwarf surf clams are missing from their original little burrows. And it looks like it's trampled around there. Who could have done this? Why, yes, it would be the sanderling. 28 grams of pure avian fury, the tyrannosaur of the tidal flat, prowling for easy prey. And oh yeah, look at that. Oh, mother lode of molluscans to the right. Check it out. So what happened was the sanderlings, as they were foraging along the beach, they see these clusters of clams. The clams are trying to get away from predation, but unwittingly, the whelks revealed where they were. So what the traces tell us is these whelks, they use this muscular foot to bury themselves by making the quicksand that caused liquefaction of the sand. The dwarf surf clams then burrowed around them, but then that brought in the sanderlings, which had an all-you-can-eat clam feast, all because of the whelks. But another interloper entered this food web, a laughing gull. So the gulls came in then. They identified the outline of the whelk as being food, plucked them out of their burrows. And what happened then was the sanderlings were like, oh yeah, more goodies. Because underneath the whelks were little crustaceans that were hiding in the sand just underneath the whelk that were released as soon as the gull plucked them out. So it sounds like a telenovela. It's very complicated, but this food web, we were able to recreate this all just from traces. Just from the traces, we could tell what was happening that particular day on that Jekyll beach. So basically, ichnology rules. I think I've convinced you now. So now we're going to shift gears. Time for a little bit of geology. If you go down to the Georgia coast, and if you're driving to the Georgia coast, you might notice as you get closer to the coast, you go up a little hill and then down a little hill. You go up a little hill, down a little hill. You are crossing barrier islands, ancient barrier islands. So over here on the left, these are ancient barrier island chains going back to the Pleistocene Epoch, so more than a couple of years ago. And as you get closer to the coast, it's representing where the shoreline used to be in the last few million years. Those humps that you're going over, those hills, are basically buried barrier islands, ancient barrier islands. As you get to the coast, the southern islands are actually composite islands then. So what you see here in the red to the west, this red is representing the most recent Pleistocene shoreline, about 45,000 years ago. So we geologists call that the Silver Bluff Islands were formed at that time. Sea level dropped during a glaciation. We got over it, things got warmer later on, and then we have the new shoreline, which you see in the yellow. So these islands that are to the south then have these composite Pleistocene Holocene islands. And the Georgia Barrier Islands are among the few islands of the world that have this kind of geology. So if you go to, say, St. Catherine's Island over here on the left, St. Catherine's, you see the Pleistocene shoreline there in the red. The maritime forest is marking basically where it is. That's the Pleistocene bedrock. Over here to the right in the yellow, that's the modern day shoreline from the modern transgression or heightening of sea level that's happened over the past 10,000 years or so. If you go north of St. Catherine's Island, then you will see where they diverge. So the Pleistocene Silver Bluff shoreline, this is on Ossabaw Island, goes up this way. It intersects with Skidaway Island. In the yellow, the Holocene shoreline then goes over to Wassa Island and Tybee Island, which are to the northeast. One of the ways geologists figured this out in the 1960s was through trace fossils and traces. So what happened was these geologists who was working on the Georgia coast, they started recognizing that these kind of pipe-like, bumpy, tube-like things that were sticking up above the sand line down at the intertidal area on the coast, on the beaches, that these were from ghost shrimp. These are burrowing shrimp that go down as much as 2 to 3 meters. They make these very complicated burrow systems, and they use little pellets to cement their walls. What's great about that for geologists is that they preserve. Look over here on the right. If you go to the west end of Sapelo and you find the right exposure, you can find these trace fossils. And this is a trace fossil that geologists call Ophiomorpha dodosa. It is a ghost shrimp burrow that tells you where the shoreline was. So the geologists were able to map where these ancient barrier islands were located based on the presence of these trace fossils. Going back to the 1960s, it's still a very useful tool today for geologists. And if you've ever wondered what a ghost shrimp looks like, and I've seen maybe 10 to 12 in my life, they burrow so deeply, you are not likely to see one. But there's one right now. Remember that picture. We're going to come back to it. If you go to the Georgia coast, one of the most signature environments, one of the best environments that you will read poetry about, you will hear people gush over how beautiful they are the marshes. So the salt marshes actually on the Georgia coast represent about 1/3 of all salt marshes in the eastern US. We are world famous for our salt marshes. So if you see these salt marshes, they're dominated by one kind of grass that you see here in the background, and that's Spartina alterniflora or smooth cord grass. The smooth cord grass is made possible. It's able to grow in that environment thanks to these animals. So you have oysters here on the left that they are suspension feeders, filter feeders. They're filtering out mud and then they're pooping out mud as sand-sized particles. That is actually making the mud then deposit there in that marsh. That gives the substrate for the Spartina to be able to grow, and their roots hold it together. Over here on the right are fiddler crabs. And the fiddler crabs, as they burrow, as they make their own pellets, whether feeding pellets or fecal pellets, they are also adding to the oxygenation and the recycling of the organic nutrients in this. Think of the fiddler crabs as being kind of like the earthworms of the salt marsh. So that's why if you take a drone and you have it above a Georgia salt marsh, looking down on that landscape, think of it as being an ichnological landscape. It's a landscape that is filled with traces. It is made of traces. You can't avoid seeing the traces, because the traces are the landscapes whenever you're looking at a salt marsh. One of the coolest things on Sapelo Island, if you ever get to the north end of the island, Cabrera Beach, just keep walking north, you'll see an old relict marsh. This marsh is about 500 years old. It gets exposed at low tide. You'll actually see the brown right there is old Spartina, just nubs of it, and the roots are in there too. It's also compressed the mud. I do not recommend you ever walk into a modern salt marsh, because you should be up to your waist in mud pretty soon. Now, on this, you can actually jump up and down on it, sing Dancing with Myself, and you're totally fine. You also look down on it, and you'll see ancient mussels. So these mussels, these bivalves that used to live in the salt marsh, they were also responsible for depositing a lot of the mud in the salt marsh along with the oysters. And they're actually still there in place. Look over on the right, there are cross sections where you can see the roots, the root traces, and burrows of fiddler crabs. So this is actually kind of a marsh that is on its way to becoming fossilized. This relic marsh then is world famous for paleontologists and geologists who study it as a way of fossilization in action, to better understand that. And this salt marsh, this ancient salt marsh, what you can do is actually go out there at low tide, and sometimes you will see some of the tidal creeks that actually wound through there. So you see this meandering break right here where the sand has filled it in of the modern beach. And look over here on the left, that's a tidal creek. And you actually see the little white spots right there are clams that would live in that tidal creek. Now, one of the cooler things I've seen on this salt marsh too is that the modern Spartina doesn't know it's a 500-year-old marsh. It's growing there anyway. I always tell my students, never trust plants. You don't know what they're going to do. And that's exactly what this Spartina is doing. It's growing now on the old marsh. And this is a cautionary tale for geologists who might look at root traces in the fossil record and say, oh, those are the same age. Better think again. They might be 500 or 1,000 years apart from one another. Now we're on to invertebrates. One of my favorites. I love, love, love invertebrate traces. So when I go to the Georgia coast, those are probably the ones I spend the most time on. So let's take a look at those. Okay, these are from Cumberland Island on the left. If you go to Cumberland Island, go to the south end of Cumberland Island in particular, you'll see these little bumps in the sand, and you'll see these paired holes. Those are from the siphons of these small clams called Donax variabilis. Sorry, I mispronounced that. So I know, Donax, don't tell. These clams, as they bury themselves at low tide, leave these distinctive bumps. Now, they also die. They go to clam heaven, I can assure you. But when they die, they leave then their bits and pieces there. These are really tiny clams, but there are enough of them sometimes that they can actually make up limestones. So if you ever go to St. Augustine and look at the old Spanish fort there at Castillo de San Marco, if you look at that fort, you will see that it is made of this coquina, this limestone that is made of coquina clams. A cool part of bivalve lore and bivalve history is that the English cannonballs actually were absorbed by this limestone and repelled the attack of the English. So these are the clams that changed history. Think of it that way. Oh, let's go to one of my favorite animals, ghost crabs. A mystery on Sapelo Island. Ruth and I were walking along the Sapelo coast, 2004, low tide, and we see this perfect outline of a crab. And I knew immediately it was from a ghost crab. No tracks leading to it, but tracks leading away from it. Did it parachute in? Did it jump? Was it dropped there? How did it get there? The mystery was solved about a month later when I went down to Sapelo again and actually observed the ghost crabs were thirsty. They were going down to the surf. It washed away their tracks leading down to the surf. They were sucking up water through their legs and through their gills. And consequently, this one must have been really thirsty because it allowed me to take a close-up picture of it. Normally, these animals run away at the as soon as a biped starts approaching them. So the trace you will see from this, and I wrote a paper about this because it hadn't been documented before, the trace you would see of this would look like this. And these have actually been interpreted as trace fossils in the fossil record, thanks to the search image that now paleontologists have to look for that tell us that these ghost crabs were thirsty on a particular day, whenever that might have been. Now here's another little invertebrate mystery trace, and it's the only one. In more than 20 years of going to the Georgia coast, this is the only one I have ever seen here. Over here on the left, that little crater, that's a ghost shrimp burrow. Those are tracks. Tracks leading from the ghost shrimp burrow, leading up to this little covered bridge kind of tunnel. And then you look at the end, and there's the little shrimp tail. I think you know where this is leading. No more mystery. This was a ghost shrimp. The ghost shrimp, this is the first time and the only time I've ever seen ghost shrimp tracks, where a ghost shrimp actually left its burrow. Who knows why? Entered the land of the giants and went across the landscape, an epic journey, only to have this one gentle giant, me, pick it up and show it to my students. And I told my students, I have never seen this before in my life. So pretty nice little discovery there. I'm hoping to see it again sometime in my life. Another little clue you might see along the Georgia coast is of these teeny weeny little trails. You'll see at low tide on the sand flat, especially in some of the runnels at low tide. Look for a little critter at the end of it, and that is a baby horseshoe crab. Oh, they're so cute. They're amazing. I have pictures of them. I didn't include it in this talk, but I have pictures of them on the end of my index finger, and they're only half the width of my index finger. They are so cute. They're cuter than Baby Yoda. I'll put it out there. Okay, over here, this is a slightly larger one. You saw a picture of it earlier. This one is a juvenile horseshoe crab. It's about maybe 2-3 centimeters across, could easily fit in your palm. What happens is these horseshoe crabs in May, they get the urge to merge. So the females will crawl up on the beaches. They are the only marine invertebrates that do this. They crawl up on the beaches, they lay their eggs, the males follow them in a frenzy, wanting to deposit their gametes to fertilize the eggs. And it's a wild, crazy PG, I'm going to keep it PG-13. It's a crazy time, put it that way. What happens though is sometimes these horseshoe crabs get stuck. And there's this incredible trace that my colleague and friend Kelly Vance at Georgia Southern recorded back in, I think this was 2008, 2009. He took these pictures of a horseshoe crab that it used its tail to try to right itself. So it's pointy tail. And then suddenly it's spiraling away. How did it do that? Thanks to Kelly. He actually picked it up and set it down. So that there it is right there on its way back. So here's another one, another large horseshoe crab that I was able to save with that Ruth had discovered one day when we were on Sapelo, stuck there on the beach. I thought it was dead. Turned out it wasn't. Long story short, it turned out that it was still alive, but left some really cool traces in the meantime. And of course, I sang Born Free when I put it back in the water. Okay, how many of you have found these? If you find these shells, whether they're snail shells, whether they're clam shells, and you find this perfectly circular beveled hole in them, and you're thinking, oh, I want to make a necklace, or that would make a great earring. Well, you would have earrings or a necklace of death, which would have been made by this animal over here, which is a moon snail, also known as a shark eye. These are not only carnivorous snails that make these drill holes with their fily tool called a radula, but they sometimes are cannibals. So actually you're seeing this. This might have been actual fratricide happening here with this moon snail. If you go inland on some of the barrier islands of the Georgia coast, this really blew me away in the late 2000s to realize that there were some of the islands that actually had freshwater crayfish. So if you see these in your backyard here in Atlanta or elsewhere in Georgia, you can be sure that these little muddy volcanoes with these pellets are from crayfish, especially if you're on a floodplain or if you're near a river or a lake. So these are indicators that are freshwater. So if you see them on a barrier island, it tells you that these animals are living near the freshwater table. This picture, this candid picture here, is of a crayfish in Decatur. That there was one year where the Decatur cemetery, they drained their pond in the cemetery. Ruth and I went down there for a walk, and there were all of these crayfish burrows and crayfish really upset that their aquatic habitat was gone. So what they do is they burrow, and that's what they do whenever they need to get to the freshwater table. If you go more inland, if you go to the dunes or if you go to the more of the sandy environments inland, away from the freshwater, you'll also see insect traces. Among those insect traces will be wasp burrows. These are made by female wasps, like this one right here. This is Stichtia, probably Stichtia signata here, or a horsefly wasp. On the left, furiously digging, this mother wasp where she is making a burrow. She's going to sting some paralyzed prey, stuff it down there, lay her eggs on it, and as you saw in the documentary film Alien and its sequel Aliens, then they will hatch and they will have fresh food for them. What's really neat is wasps were doing this at least 75 million years ago. Over here on the right, that picture I showed of me in Montana, this is part of the work I was doing there. That is a burrow going down to a cocoon that was left by a wasp 75 million years ago, doing very much the same behavior. So here's where you can use the Georgia coast as a model for what you see in the fossil record. Okay, taking a drink from my local brew. Let's see here, beaks and bones. Now we're talking vertebrates. Now we're getting to some really big critters. So over here on the left, for instance, these are alligator tracks. And this is from a very large alligator that the day I took this picture, I think the next day I almost stepped on this alligator, but that's another story. I survived. Notice the raccoon track here in the middle, where the raccoon doesn't realize that there's a very large alligator in the area. There's the tail drag right there. Here's what's really fascinating is that several hours later, this is what the fiddler crabs did. So this was an alligator walking through the sandy part of a salt marsh right next to the coast. So this alligator went for a walk at low tide. Just within a couple of hours, the fiddler crabs had almost completely erased the tracks. So I refer to this as erasing the tracks of a monster, that the fiddler crabs were able to do this so quickly. The same thing then happened on the sandy beaches of Sapelo. So then Ruth and I saw this several years later, where an alligator going out for seafood every day, its freshwater pond is behind the dunes there. So going out for seafood, coming back, after it walked across there just a couple of hours later, the ghost crab started erasing it. So the ghost crabs walked into those low-lying areas made by the tracks in that local landscape, and they started erasing the tracks and erasing the tail traces as well. So we were lucky enough, after seeing these tracks so often going into the water and going out of the water, defying the common sense axiom of, I thought alligators were freshwater only. Well, there they are. They're actually in the water. And we actually were lucky enough in the past couple of years to see some of these alligators out in the surf where they were going out for their all-you-can-eat seafood feast, augmenting their diet in the freshwater or on land. So alligators, I guess, summary statement, alligators are cool. This one is a really neat one. Gail Bishop sent me this photo. I did not actually observe this. He sent me this photo and he said, what do you think's going on here? And this was a toad that did not come a courting. And what it was doing was it had a bathroom visit, and actually several bathroom visits. Now the tracks match those of a southern toad. So southern toads, they do get onto the beaches once in a while. This one was hopping. It stopped. It backed up. It pooped. Then it moved forward a little bit. Then it peed. Then it did alternate walking, not hopping. So you see hopping, poop, pee, alternate walking, peed again, didn't get it all out. Okay, must have had too many beers that night, and then took off from there. This to me was a fascinating little story, all encapsulated there in just less than a meter of sand, square meters of sand. And I thought, what if, as an ichnologist, if I saw it in a fossil record, could I interpret that? Maybe, maybe not. One of the better, most favorite traces I love seeing on the Georgia coast are those of birds flying. So you can sometimes see takeoff, you can sometimes see landing tracks. The ones on the left, these are from a great egret, those big white wading birds that you see along the Georgia coast and sometimes in the Atlanta area. This is one that was landing. Notice the scratch, the long scratch from its rear toe as it landed. Over on the right, this is a Cretaceous track from a Cretaceous bird of Australia that did exactly the same thing. Long scratch from the rear toe, the mounding of the sand right there as it came to a sudden stop. And there's a close-up of the one, and I think that one was from Jekyll Island, that one there on the left. And this is again how paleontologists and ichnologists are able to use these modern traces as ways to understand the fossil record. And just in case you couldn't quite visualize that, I drew it for you so that you can better understand that what happened was one toe, as the bird is landing, is taking up some of that weight, some of that pressure, some of that stress, and getting transmitted to the sand before the other foot lands. So it's one foot, then the other foot. Now, these are mystery burrows, and these burrows really mystified me for a while. I thought they were from ghost crabs. A great example of how in science we do not prove, we disprove, because after we puzzled over these, what could have made these long burrows that went down to the surf line? They start in the dunes, they go all the way down to the surf line, and then discovered way in the interior of the islands, you see the same burrow. And you go, that's not a ghost crab. Well, the answer is moles. So I was making mountains out of molehills or something like that because it just was wrong. So that was a good lesson in humility through ecology. If you want to have fun, on the Georgia coast, I recommend finding some otter tracks. When you find the otter tracks, you can't help but get into the spirit of the otter because they will gallop, they will trot, they will lope, they will sometimes slow down, walk, sniff. They'll then jump into the surf and play in the surf and then come back out and lope onto the land, shake off a little bit. They're having a great time. Otters just want to have fun. And sometimes you can follow these tracks and just have that whole experience, recreate that whole experience that the otter had just a few hours before you. Okay, now we're getting into that species that we're always thinking about, us, the human touch. How do humans affect traces on the Georgia Barrier Islands? And this is the way where I, as a geologist, I have to kind of filter out those human effects, but acknowledge also they're here and they're here to stay. So over on the left, for instance, that's on Sapelo Island. This is a trail. This trail is worn down by feral cattle. Yes, you heard me right. There are feral cattle, wild cattle on Sapelo Island. How many are there? It's a good question. They are cryptic creatures of the night. You don't see them there unless you look very carefully or wait for them. You probably will not see them during a day trip, but you will find their traces. Over on the right, this is a trail made by feral horses, wild horses on Cumberland Island. So these are actually where non-native species to the islands are actually altering the landscapes of those islands. So on Sapelo Island, I'm fascinated by these feral cattle. And this is one of the few instances of where we've seen one of the feral cattle, this one horned bull here, which we did not approach because that would have been a really bad idea. Earlier in the day, we found that bull's tracks here on the beach. I have only seen bull tracks on the beach maybe twice in all of my years of going to Sapelo Island. But here, a bull had actually gone down to the beach, left those tracks. Very unusual because normally they're in the interior of the island. So through tracks, we can start to better understand what these wild feral species are doing, which is really more Pleistocene behavior, more the behavior of their ancestors. Now, with feral horses on Cumberland Island, the only island on the Georgia coast that has wild horses, they also have a major impact on the island. So one of the things they do is they, of course, walk across the dunes. If you did that on a natural seashore, you would be fined. If you pulled up the sea oats out of their roots, you would also get fined. If you were wearing a horse suit and you did that, you would be okay because the horses are allowed to do that on Cumberland. So anyway, they do have an effect. They do graze, they do trample on the island. I actually had an undergraduate student do an honors thesis where she did satellite mapping of the trails on the southeastern end of Cumberland, and she was able to answer the question that yes, indeed, horses actually changed the landscape of that island. So what she did was through GIS mapping, she was able to map the changes in the trails over time and that these trails definitely increased over time and actually changed the sand budget on that southeastern end of the island by decreasing the vegetation. So do they have an effect? The answer is yes. Feral hogs on some of the other islands also have a major impact on the islands. So hogs are omnivores. They eat everything. They are everywhere. They will actually go down into the salt marshes. They will go down to the shore and into the maritime forest. They are equal opportunity omnivores. So as a result, they end up eating a lot of their environments. So you can see their traces all throughout the landscapes of the islands affected by them. So this could be on the left, that's I think that is on St. Catherine's Island. On the right is on Cumberland. So they are a problem on a lot of the southern islands that don't have many people on them. So this is a problem. They also eat, they also see sea turtle eggs. So that's always a bad thing as well. Now we're jumping into human traces. So what you saw were feral species, the traces of feral species brought by humans in just the last 500 years with colonization of the islands. If you go back 4 to 5,000 years, you'll see traces of the first human inhabitants on the Georgia Barrier Islands. So over there on the left over there, there's Ruth for scale. She is in the cross section of a shell mound. These are 100 to 150-meter wide ring-like or horseshoe shaped deposits of shells, shell mounds that are on some of the islands. Some of them are gone now, but these are basically big shell middens that were left by the original people who lived on the Barrier Islands, whether they were ancestors of the Wali people who then were there when the Spanish arrived. Now, fast forward a few hundred years after the Spanish arrived, colonized the islands, and then there was an assimilation and decimation of the native tribes there. What happened was the English, when they took over and the French took over parts of the islands and started a slavery-based economy, then they started making the plantations. The plantation buildings were actually mined from the shell mounds. So this is on Sapelo Island, just less than a kilometer away from the shell mound you saw in the previous photo, where these tabby buildings for the plantations were made using enslaved Africans to make these buildings. So as an example of recycling of the local materials there as a human trace, kind of a human trace that's recycling another human trace. If you go into Savannah on the Georgia coast, go to the old part of the city near the river, go to the Riverwalk, you will see these cobblestone streets. The cobblestones, me as a geologist, I started looking at them and realized these are all from Europe. These are ballast stones, and you see here, that is a Carboniferous limestone. That ain't from South Georgia. Over here, this is a sandstone that looks like it has some fossil burrows, vertical burrows in it. These are probably mostly from Europe. They were dumped there by ships back in the 18th and 19th century, and those ships then went back to Europe loaded with indigo, cotton, and other goods. Well, these are traces of slavery. So when you see these islands, these hammock islands along some of the channels, these are actually ballast islands. So the ballast stones that you'll see making up some of the walls, some of the streets in Savannah, as well as these islands, if you're on the ferry going to Sapelo, you'll see these ballast islands that are composed of the stones that came from Europe and then were dumped by those ships, and then they were going back to Europe. So it's a kind of cryptic trace, a large cryptic trace showing that there was slavery and evidence of slavery left in this landscape. Now, the ultimate human trace is climate change. So what's been happening with climate change as sea level's been going up? We've also had a record year for tropical storms. This is from Tropical Storm Matthew on Odyssey Island, where it actually started uprooting some of these very old, large live oaks, no longer alive, oaks, and washing away causeways and otherwise altering these islands very quickly. So one of the predictions with climate change, as sea level goes up, that's going to change the coast. As storms become more common, that's going to change the coast. And it's going to do it very quickly. So on Jekyll Island, if you're riding your bike, like you saw at the beginning of this talk, you're out riding your bike, you're going to the north end of the island, you're going to what's been called Boneyard Beach. And sometimes you will go there and the bicycle path will be washed out. That's because of the storms. So Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Irma actually washed out the bicycle path back just a few years ago. So over here, there's the bicycle path. So you see going to the north end, there's that really nice pier that's up in the north end of Jekyll. And here's a close-up of it where it's been breached. Look at how the sand, so first of all, the forest is gone. Now this is the beach. The beach is now moving over the marsh. So my prediction is, based on this rate of movement, is in another 10, 15 years, this part of the marsh is going to be gone, and this is going to be new beach. This is happening very quickly as a result of rise in sea level and climate change. Fortunately, we have geologists, we have ichnologists, we have paleontologists who can tell you this is what sea level was like during the Pleistocene. There's a storm washover fan 1 meter above present day sea level. And we can tell you, and this is a study I did with my good friend Andy Rinsberg, a study we did of this storm washover fan on St. Catherine's Island, where we were able to use that as a model for this is what's going to happen in the future with climate change. And then as we project that going into the future, if you have 1 meter rise in sea level, if it goes back to during the Pleistocene, when we had this meter high, 2 meter high, higher than now sea level, this is what Jekyll Island will look. So I would recommend some of their golf courses. They might want to move those, some of the development there that they have with the hotels going on down there probably, and the water park is going to take on a different meaning down there at the south end of the island. It's going to be really different just within the next 100 years or so. So of course we have artwork because I love art. So Ruth and I, we did an art show at Fernbank a little over 9 years ago. Fernbank, that this is called an abstraction of sea level rise, and this abstraction of sea level rise, this is actually a hypothesis, where in this we're showing here's a cross section of what those traces would look like now, and then as sea level goes up, these are going to be the traces of the future. As a result of that area is going to be inundated as sea level continues to go up. So just to summarize and review, we're near the end now. Traces tell us stories about the natural human histories of the Georgia coast. These stories are from the past and present, but we can use them to predict the future. And then traces and trace fossils are showing us an intersection between biology and geology. For us, ichnologists, we don't see that division. We see those two as naturally blending one into the other. So if you want to read more about this, and if you want to read some of the more detailed stories about this, then you can get my new book. Just came out just 6 months ago, almost 6 months to the day, came out. You can order it directly from UGA Press. You can get a pretty good deal there, or ask your local independent bookstore, or even better, ask your library to get it, because then you keep your library solvent and it's free for you. Okay. Oh, yeah. Also, I want to really put in a plug with my colleagues at Emory. We've been doing this for the last 5 years. There's this free website, lots of information about the Georgia coast, georgiacoastatlas.org. Check that out. If you want to find some little videos, unfortunately, that's star me, but little videos and pictures and text telling you more about the islands, we have a website. It's in progress, but we have a lot of good information there. So you can check that out. So thanks very much to the Science Tavern, to Science for Georgia, University of Georgia Press. I am raising my glass right now. And yes, that is a sunset picture through a beer while a bird is flying by. It doesn't get much better than that. And of course, I always thank the trace makers, because without them, it would not be possible.